On May 16, 2008, Ursula Eriksson visited her sister, Sabina, at her family home in the town of Malå in County Cork, Ireland. After staying there for a few hours, Sabina argued with her husband and left the family home with Ursula in secret. She left her husband, her home, and her 2 children behind and disappeared with her sister. No explanation was given. The following day, the pair would appear again after a bus service prevented them from boarding due to their suspicious and erratic behaviour. When police caught up with the 2 women, they would witness some of the most shocking behaviour ever captured on camera. Some scenes in this video may be disturbing for some viewers. When you see the following symbol in the top right corner and hear the following sound, a possibly disturbing image will follow. When you hear the sound again, the image is finished and it's safe to watch. While little is known about Sabina and Ursula Eriksson's early life, what we do know is that they were born as identical twin sisters in Sweden on the 3rd of November 1967. They had an older sister named Mona and an older brother named Bjorn. They lived a pretty normal, uneventful Swedish childhood, and there were no history of mental illnesses in either themselves or their families. They also had no criminal convictions either. By the time they were adults in 2000, Ursula was living in the United States while Sabina had moved to Malå in Ireland to start a family. What few accounts there are of the women report them as being friendly and pleasant. According to reports, Ursula came to Ireland to visit Sabina from the USA. For reasons unknown, the women then left the family home in secret, making their way to Liverpool by ferry. Dublin police would later confirm that Sabina had an argument with her husband prior to her suddenly leaving the property. They arrived in Liverpool at around 8:30 AM and went to St Anne's Street Police Station to file a report about the safety concerns for Sabina's children back in Ireland. The police said that they would liaise with Dublin police and follow up on this. The women then boarded a National Express coach service at around 11:30, which was headed for London. When they reached the motorway service station in Kiel, about 50 miles south of Liverpool, the women disembarked to use the restroom as they were not feeling very well. The driver of the bus later reported that he refused to let the women board the bus again because of their strange behaviour. He noticed that they gripped their bags very tightly and refused to let anyone look inside. The women were left at the Kiel service station where the manager called the police to report 2 strange women acting in an erratic fashion at the station. Officers arrived and spoke with the women but left after finding the 2 harmless, a statement that was later proven to be gravely incorrect. A short while later, the women were spotted on motorway CCTV by transit police, who sent some officers to investigate as the 2 women were very haphazardly crossing the central lanes of a busy high-speed motorway. Their crossing caused havoc on the motorway, with Sabina being hit by a Seat Leon during their attempts to cross the lanes. The police, which arrived on the scene, were actually being followed for the day by a camera crew shooting a TV series about British transport police. And what they caught on camera is genuinely some of the most shocking footage I'd ever seen. As police were being told of the situation with the camera crew watching, for no reason at all, Ursula decided to run across the motorway lane and was hit by a truck travelling 50 miles per hour. Her legs were immediately crushed. In the commotion, Sabina also broke free and ran into oncoming traffic. She was hit head-on by a high-speed Volkswagen Polo, rendering her unconscious. Paramedics rushed to tend to the 2 women, but Ursula repeatedly resisted treatment by biting and scratching at the paramedics despite having crushed legs. as though she couldn't feel any pain at all.
Calm down.
I'm gonna harm you!
Mine's very aggressive, spitting at me. She is very badly injured.
As Ursula screamed, "I recognize you. I know you're not real." At the officers detaining her, Sabina regained consciousness and shouted, "They're going to steal your organs." What she did next just made the story seem more bizarre. After being hit by a high-speed car and being knocked unconscious for 15 minutes, Sabina jumped to her feet, punched the police officer before jumping over the barrier, into moving traffic into the other lanes and running away. Police later caught up with Sabina further down the motorway before restraining her and sedating her. It took a number of officers to restrain her, with one stating that he felt there had to be a substance abuse issue because she had incredible strength. After Sabina was subdued and detained, both sisters were taken to hospital to assess their injuries. Amazingly, Sabina had no serious injuries and was released into police custody. Despite being hit by a car, arrested, and having watched her sister's legs being crushed beneath a truck, Sabina seemed calm and relaxed, and displayed no outward concern for her sister at all. After being in police custody over the weekend, Sabina pled guilty in court to trespassing on the motorway and assault of a police officer, and was sentenced to 1 day in custody, which the court classed as already served. She was then released free, back into society again. She was never given a psychiatric evaluation while in custody or at the hospital. After being released from court, Sabina wandered the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, trying to find out which hospital her sister was being treated in. She was still carrying her possessions in the clear plastic bag which the police returned them in. At around 7 p.m, 2 local men were out walking their dog when they spotted Sabina wandering, and generally looking very out of place. These men were Glenn Hollinshead, a 54-year-old welder and retired RAF airman, and his friend Peter Malloy. They approached Sabina and started to talk to her. Sabina seemed friendly and talkative and crouched to stroke Glenn's dog. While Peter later stated that Sabina did seem friendly, she was also acting very nervously, which in turn made him feel nervous. Sabina asked them if they knew of any local hotels or B&Bs. Glenn, perhaps recognizing that Sabina had limited financial means, offered the use of his house for the night on Duke Street nearby. Sabina began to relax and began to explain that she was looking for a hospitalized sister, though it's not known if she illustrated why her sister had been hospitalized. Once inside Glenn's house, he offered her a drink and said that in the morning he would help her find her sister. Peter later described Sabina as very paranoid and nervous, and was always jumping up to look out the window, which led him to believe that perhaps she'd run away from an abusive partner. Her behaviour became even more bizarre as the evening went on, as she offered the men cigarettes only to then quickly snatch them out of their mouths, claiming that they might be poisoned. Just before midnight, Peter decided to leave and went home, and as far as we can tell, Glenn and Sabina both went to sleep. The following day, around midday, Glenn spoke with his brother on the phone trying to locate the local hospital where Ursula might be, and proceeded to call around various places to help locate her. Later in the evening, around 7:40 p.m, Glenn was in the middle of cooking dinner for the pair when he realised that he needed some tea bags and went next door to ask if they would give him some. The neighbour gave Glenn some tea bags and watched him go back inside, and less than a minute later, he stumbled back out again covered in blood with multiple wounds and shouted, "She stabbed me," before collapsing to the ground and dying from his injuries. The neighbour quickly ran inside and called the police and ambulance. While the neighbour was calling for help, Sabina ran out of the house and down the street and was caught on nearby CCTV, running away from the scene with a hammer in her hand, stopping every few feet to hit herself in the head with the hammer. A man driving by in his car witnessed this and stopped his car to go and help by tackling her and wrestling the hammer out of her hands, only for Sabina to pull a broken roof tile from her pocket and smash the man on the back of the head with the tile, stunning him so she could run away again. Not long after this, paramedics and police arrived and chased Sabina to a bridge at Heron Cross, where she jumped off a 40-foot bridge and onto the motorway below, breaking both her ankles and fracturing her skull. The paramedics then took her to hospital for treatment. On the 6th of June 2008, Sabina was placed under official arrest while still recovering from her injuries in hospital. She was discharged a couple of months later on September 11, 2008, in a wheelchair, and was taken into police custody and charged with murder. Coincidentally, Ursula was also released from hospital in September and moved back to Sweden before eventually going back to the US. Sabina's trial was scheduled for February 2009, but was delayed until September 2009 as the court was having a hard time compelling her Swedish doctors to release her medical records due to Sweden's extremely strict medical privacy laws. On September 2nd, Sabina pled guilty to the charge of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. At no point during police interrogation or cross-examination in court did she ever even attempt to explain or justify her actions, always replying no comment to every question. Strangely, the video of her and Ursula running into oncoming traffic on the motorway was never used or played during the case, even though it strengthened her plea of temporary insanity. The defense successfully argued that Sabina was insane at the time of the murder, but then had become sane again at the point of the trial. The defense stated she was the secondary sufferer of an extremely rare mental health illness called folie à deux, which is a form of temporary psychosis which is passed from one person to another when they have a particularly strong bond. The defense stated that Ursula was the primary sufferer and Sabina had contracted it due to her sister's presence or the perception of her sister's presence. The defense also stated that Sabina had been suffering from auditory hallucinations. Her plea was accepted by the judge and he stated that Sabina clearly had a low level of culpability for her actions due to the strong mental health episode that she'd been suffering. He said, "I understand that this sentence will seem entirely inadequate to the relatives of the deceased. However, I've sentenced on the basis that the reason for the killing was the mental illness, and therefore the culpability of the defendant is low, and therefore the sentence I have passed is designed to protect the public. It is not designed to reflect the grief the relatives have suffered, or to measure the value of Mr. Hollinshead's life. No sentence that I could pass could do that. It is a sentence which I hope fairly measures a truly tragic event. Sabina was suffering from delusions which she believed to be true, and they dictated her behaviour. It is not one of those cases where the defendant could have done something to avoid the onset." Sabina was then sentenced to 5 years in prison. Having already spent 439 days in custody, this meant that she was eligible for parole in 2011. After being paroled, no further details of Sabina's whereabouts or actions are available anywhere.
Hi, this is the section of the video where I give you my thoughts and opinions on what I've seen in the case. I just want to remind you that this is just my opinion and it is not filled with any revelatory facts. Just the conclusions that I've come to based on the evidence that I've seen. So we'll start with the police incompetence. As with most of the cases that I've looked at so far, the police came under heavy criticism in this case for not doing their job properly. Some people commented that they should never have let Sabina go when she was clearly a very mentally unhinged individual, and that she should have been kept under supervision for longer. But I think that stems from a general misunderstanding of British law. Firstly, according to UK law, nobody can be held for longer than 24 hours unless they're suspected of a serious crime. The definition of serious crime here in the UK is incredibly narrow. So the police can't hold you for longer than 24 hours unless you're suspected of a serious crime. The only other circumstance where they might be able to hold you for longer is if a psychiatrist has attended you and deemed you to be a risk to the public or to yourself. Those are the only two conditions in which someone can be held for longer than 24 hours here in the UK. Now, the only crime that either of these two girls at the time of the initial arrest had committed was trespassing on a public highway and a minor assault of a police officer, neither of which fits the very narrow definition of a serious crime here in the UK. So the police really had no alternative. They had to release them after 24 hours. There was no other legal recourse for them. You could argue that maybe she should have been held using the UK Mental Health Act, which allows police to hold an individual for longer based on them having any kind of mental health episode, which is a fair point, but you can't really use the Mental Health Act in that way here in the UK. In the past, it was used to detain people for unlawfully long periods of time without any evidence, and so the legal system here in the UK started to change how you can use that act to make it more strict and stop police from abusing it. So now you can only hold someone under the Mental Health Act if a psychiatrist has attended the patient within 6 hours of them first being detained. Now, even if a psychiatrist turns up, 6 hours and 1 minute into their detainment, it doesn't matter. They have to be let go. If a psychiatrist attends within that 6-hour period and deems the person to be a risk to themselves or to the public, then they can be held under the Mental Health Act for a determinate period based on what the psychiatrist says. However, in this case, due to a chronic lack of funding by multiple governments, the NHS doesn't actually have that many psychiatrists on staff. It's a role which is critically understaffed. So there was no psychiatrist available to attend Sabina within that 6-hour time frame, and so again, the police really didn't have any choice. They had to let her go because there was no way they could use the law, and there's no way they could use the Mental Health Act either. The judge also got some criticism in this case for what many people perceived to be him being soft on a very serious crime. It was a very brutal murder conducted by a very disturbed individual, and he sentenced her to 5 years. Now, some people thought that he was going too soft on crime, this particular crime in this case. But if you read back what he said in his case summary, I think he had a pretty good handle on what the extenuating factors were in this case. And it's pretty rare in my studies of both law and mental health. It's pretty rare for the law to understand mental health well enough to treat it properly. And in this case, I really do think the judge did understand that, this is a person who was having a mental health episode and was not in total control of their actions or even cognizant of what they were doing. And so I think he made the right decision, and I think the statement that he gave reflects that. This is the point that I found difficult because I research an awful lot of weird psychological conditions because they tend to be the most interesting ones to research. And I'd never heard of folie à deux before. Sorry, French people, if I'm butchering that. I'm really not good at speaking French. When I heard of this case and this outcome, I was really surprised by it because I'd never heard of it. It's a very, very rare condition. In fact, it's so rare that there are less than 20 recorded cases throughout the entire human history. It's so rare, in fact, that many psychologists even dispute that it exists, because even the current cases that do exist don't meet the diagnostic criteria for the condition itself, which is kind of funny. What made this a bit more unusual for me is that the recommended treatment for folie à deux, back when it was something that could be diagnosed, was to separate the two patients and to give them anti-anxiolytics and to give them antipsychotics. Now in this case, both women were given those treatments. They were separated. They were given anti-anxiolytics and antipsychotics as well as painkillers because they were involved in a big accident that suffered a major injury. So just on the basis of their normal treatment, they were accidentally given the correct treatment for folie à deux. Now, while both defense and prosecution accepted this diagnosis in court, I find it a bit dubious for a couple of reasons. In all the literature on this condition, it's stated that once the two sufferers are separated and they're issued with medical intervention, so the drugs that I've already mentioned, the condition abates almost immediately, as soon as the drugs take effect. But that didn't happen in this case. according to the defense. Defense stated that Sabina was the secondary sufferer and Ursula was the primary sufferer. And there are no examples of this condition continuing after the two patients have been separated, which is why some very weaselly wording by the defense raised my eyebrow. The perceived presence of her sister. I think the defense knew that if it was researched enough, the prosecution would point out that actually this condition doesn't carry on once the two people are separated. In every single case, that's what happens. And so they came up with this very weaselly wording of saying perceived presence of her sister as a way to alleviate some of the responsibility and guilt from Sabina. I do want to stress though that I think the judge got the sentencing correct and his comments correct, because she was clearly suffering a mental health episode. What's in dispute is what the cause of that mental health episode was. Now the defense's wording raised my eyebrow because I'm not convinced that her state of psychosis was caused by folie à deux. Throughout reading this case, I repeatedly felt like substance abuse problem was far more likely than a mental health condition that's so rare that more people have walked on the moon. A few drugs sprung to mind initially. I started thinking about dissociative drugs, things like ketamine or PCP, which can induce some of the behavior that the two exhibited and does explain their incredible resistance to pain. However, psychotic delusions and paranoid delusions really aren't associated with either of those two drugs very commonly. I spent some time looking around websites where people talk about using those drugs and nobody ever reported those things happening, so I started thinking about other drugs instead. Eventually, I landed on heavy amphetamine use, which then causes amphetamine-induced sleep deprivation psychosis. It seems like a long thing, but it's more simple than it sounds. See, everybody, when they're deprived of sleep, eventually goes into a state of psychosis. It doesn't matter who you are, how strong you are. Eventually, everybody suffers from it. What differs is how long it takes you to get there. Amphetamine use tends to accelerate this, partly because some of the side effects of amphetamine use really do perpetuate some of those symptoms, but also because it keeps you awake for abnormally long periods of time. A quick disclaimer is that this is mostly conjecture on my part because there's actually no evidence of drug use whatsoever. No drugs were found on the girl's person, and none were found in their possessions either. But if you look at how they were described by witnesses, it fits in with a lot of what amphetamine use and sleep deprivation does cause. So they're depicted as being agitated, twitchy and suspicious of their surroundings and of other people, and they refuse to allow anyone to search their belongings. When the driver asked to take a look in their bags, they said no, which is why he kicked them off the bus. They also disappeared in the night time rather than the daytime, and there's no reports anywhere of either sister having slept at any point throughout this entire ordeal. That doesn't mean they didn't sleep. Maybe it's just that people didn't think that that was an important enough detail to include in reports, or it could be that they actually didn't sleep. There is a lot of research on sleep deprivation-induced psychosis, and in almost all cases, it's reported that the longer a person is awake, the more frequent and the more intense those periods of psychosis become. The point at which you start to suffer from those psychotic delusions differs from one person to another, but they do happen to every single person who's deprived of sleep. Symptoms of sleep psychosis are hallucinations, delusions, and confused or disturbed thoughts. Specifically to amphetamine-induced psychosis is lack of concentration, delusions of persecution, increased motor activity, disorganized thoughts, lack of insight, anxiety, suspicion, auditory hallucinations, and dulled pain responses. These two women displayed every single one of those symptoms. This would also explain why, when they were separated, Sabina still suffered from these psychotic episodes while Ursula didn't. Ursula was unconscious, so she didn't suffer from those delusions anymore. But Sabina should have had all those symptoms abate by the time she was released from hospital again, having been accidentally treated for the thing that they eventually thought she had. But she didn't. And the reason for that is the amphetamines were still keeping her awake. She was still right in the middle of that psychotic episode because she hadn't slept. Occam's razor, which seems more likely, that the two sisters had been using a widely available drug known to induce and cause a lot of the symptoms that they were suffering from. Or they were suffering from a psychological disorder so rare and strange that many psychologists don't even believe it exists. I'll let you decide. So the question then becomes, how did they end up at folie à deux if they don't fit, if there's a lot of debate that the condition even exists? The answer is clever lawyering. When they were initially interviewed by Motorway Police on the BBC TV show, one of the police officers said that he immediately suspected there was a substance abuse problem because of her incredible strength. And given that he's a police officer, I'm sure he would have encountered substance abuse problems often enough to know what it looks like. However, it's really not easy to prove this because there's no evidence of drug use beyond outward appearances. They had none on their persons and none in their possessions. Now that doesn't mean that there were never any drugs there. They could have consumed them all. The police in the UK are not allowed to take blood samples without your consent. Unless you're suspected of drug or drink driving, and then they can take a blood sample whether you consent to it or not. Note for all the drug and drink drivers out there. Second note, don't drug or drink drive, ever. So the cops in the UK can't take a blood sample without your consent or without a senior officer giving authority as well as consent. So they couldn't take a sample from either woman because neither consented to it, so they couldn't prove any drug use. The only other way that the prosecution could have possibly taken it down to drug use was if they could demonstrate a history of substance abuse problems in the person's medical report. Normally in the UK, that would be fairly simple. You'd petition the medical report from the person's GP, the GP would release it. It's pretty common here for that to happen. However, in Sweden, the Swedish privacy laws are extremely strict in regards to medical records. So strict, in fact, that even Swedish police often have to petition courts multiple times and justify it multiple times before they're allowed to have a medical report released. So the police here in the UK and the lawyers here in the UK just couldn't get that report. So, in the absence of a positive drug test or a medical history of drug abuse, all the defense had to do was come up with a semi-plausible theory, and it would have to be accepted by default because there was nothing to challenge it. Folie à deux. Finally, I want to point out again that this section of the video is really just my opinion, and you shouldn't take anything that I've said as fact. It is just the conclusion that I've come to based on the evidence that I've seen and my own personal experience and education. It does not make it true. That's the story of the two women who ran into oncoming traffic and stabbed the man to death. What do you think happened? Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video.